Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the years 1920 to 45 and of World War II. In previous lectures, we've talked about some of the causes of the war, the diplomatic conditions leading up to it. We've also talked about the American home front, and particularly the wartime production that brought an end to the Great Depression and kept the machinery of the war rolling throughout the war. In this final series of lectures, we'll talk about the combat itself in the European theater and in the Pacific as well, starting with this preliminary lecture, which will focus primarily on the war in the Atlantic. As we've discussed previously, the United States remained neutral, or at least had not actively declared war, until the attack at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And this was a horrible war, on a scale of destruction like nothing the world had ever seen, including World War I. More than 50 million total deaths resulted from this war, and some estimates range as high as 60 million. There were new methods of destruction and technology, much more effective and powerful tanks and motorized vehicles, well-coordinated attacks, planes, bombs, and guns of all varieties, aircraft carriers, and of course culminating with the atomic bomb. And the atrocities and deaths from this war were much worse than anything the world had ever seen. By the end of the war, as we'll discuss, we're talking about kamikaze pilots, suicidal Japanese pilots crashing their planes loaded with bombs onto American ships, a mass grave of more than 100,000 Polish murdered by the Soviets, more than 150,000 killed from the atomic bomb dropped at Hiroshima, and 140,000 killed at Nagasaki. And of course, there was the unimaginable genocide of the Jews in the concentration camps, more than 6 million murdered, all told. So the United States had to go to war after the attack at Pearl Harbor. But the kind of destruction I've just mentioned should also make us consider that American efforts to remain neutral were not so misguided. We were entering a horrible war in December of 1941. At the same time, for all intents and purposes, the United States had been waging war in the Atlantic for the better part of a year, primarily against German U-boats, submarines, that traveled in packs known as wolf packs, groups of 8 to 10 of these submarines stalking the waters and then surfacing at just the right moment to launch an attack, send a torpedo into the side of an American ship. And the picture you see here is a rare photograph of just that moment. By 1942, German submarines absolutely dominated in the Atlantic. There was no effective counterattack against the submarines. By 1942, these attacks had reached the coastlines of the United States itself in an operation known as Operation Drumbeat. These German wolf packs ravaged American shipping, sinking some 400 American ships over the course of the war. It's also during this period, as I mentioned in the previous lectures, that coastal cities were going through blackouts. Cities like Jacksonville, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, and on up the Atlantic seaboard. Not from power outages, but to dim the lights in the city so the Germans, who were just off the coast, would not be able to spot major cities or targets from the ocean. So this was a very scary time for the United States, and a time in which the Germans effectively dominated the war in the Atlantic. The war in the Atlantic also brought together two of the war's most important leaders, FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They met several times over the course of the war, and in fact the first of those personal meetings occurred before the United States had even declared war, in August of 1941, when they met on board the HMS Prince of Wales off the coast of Newfoundland. Perhaps most famously, over the course of that meeting, they went to a church service on board the ship, at the end of which all of the servicemen sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers." As Churchill explained, I felt that this was no vain presumption, but that we had the right to feel that we're serving a cause for the sake of which a trumpet sounded from on high. So the meeting provided great motivation for Churchill, for FDR, and for people on both sides. At the end of this meeting, the two issued a statement that came to be known as the Atlantic Charter, which broadly established some goals for the course of the conflict. No territorial aggrandizement, no territorial changes made against the wishes of the people, self-determination and self-government, and so on. This was not a formal written treaty, and recall that the United States at that point had not even officially declared war, so it's more the signal of a partnership and some broad aims of the war itself. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, Churchill visited with FDR again, this time coming to Washington and staying there for 3 weeks, really becoming almost part of the family in the White House. Over the course of these meetings, FDR and Churchill laid out some more firm strategies, and of course at this point the United States is officially part of the war. And so they discussed several elements of the war going forward, perhaps the most important of which was the idea that Hitler and the Germans remained the most pressing threat and would be the top priority, and therefore that America's conflict in the Pacific would more or less be put on hold, at least for a time. They also discussed the options for perhaps launching an attack into mainland Europe, which is the process known as opening a second front in the war. Now, if we think about this from the perspective of a second front, well, what's the first front? What's the primary front? And we need to recall what the state of the war at that point was in Europe. The Blitzkrieg has already occurred. Germany has essentially taken all of continental Europe. At that point was fighting the Battle of Britain, but the primary front in the war was the front in Russia. And so it was Russia and its leader, Joseph Stalin, who were crying for the European allies and the United States to open a second front, that is, launch an attack into continental mainland Europe, which would then force Hitler to fight actively on two fronts. So think about it that way. The second front is really greatest to the benefit of the Russians, who at that time were bearing the brunt of the war. And so Churchill and FDR really discussed that issue during a third meeting in June of 1942, when Churchill returned to the United States. At that time, they talked a lot about how this second front might occur. And after much debate and discussion and weighing their options, they decided that the best course was, at that time, not to launch a direct attack into Europe, but rather to attack German forces in northern Africa, where they thought they might have some stronger strategic advantages. And so it's not to Europe that we turn for the first part of this discussion, but rather to Africa. From late 1942 to mid-1943, the Allies fought against the German armies in northern Africa. For military buffs, this is some of the most interesting warfare of the course of World War II and perhaps ever. The brilliant German field general, Erwin Rommel, who was nicknamed the Desert Fox, led his Africa Corps against superior numbers of Allied forces, and yet outwitted them time and again. But by mid-1943, Rommel and his armies were caught between British and American forces, and after being hammered for a time, they retreated, many of them managing to escape to Sicily, just across the Mediterranean Sea, and then on back up to Germany. The Allies, over the course of this conflict, had won their first major victory in the Atlantic Campaign. With the battle for North Africa still unfolding, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca in one of many wartime conferences between the great leaders. Out of this meeting came Roosevelt's announcement that the Allies would continue fighting until the unconditional surrender of the Germans. This announcement served two purposes. First, that there would be no misunderstanding as to who came out of this war as a victor. And this is hearkening back to the end of World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles left many unsatisfied. And it also assured Stalin and the Russians that there was not going to be a separate peace, that the Allies wouldn't sign a separate truce with Germany and leave the Russians hanging. Eventually, there would be the Second Front that Stalin was calling for. Unfortunately, he was going to have to wait still another year before the Allies agreed to open that Second Front. First, FDR and Churchill agreed to launch attacks through Sicily and Italy, getting at Germany by what Winston Churchill described as the soft underbelly of Europe. Of course, the fighting in Italy proved to be some of the harshest of the entire war, and if they thought this was going to be a relatively quick and easy trip up to Germany, Allied leaders were horribly wrong. The Italian campaign lasted nearly 2 years, from July of 1943 to May of 1945, although the period before the D-Day attack of 1944 was the primary fighting. So their goal was not only to reach Germany through this soft underbelly, but also to occupy and draw German attention away from other Allied attacks, and in some ways from their attacks in Russia as well. On July 10th, 1943, Allied forces launched the invasion of Sicily, which was codenamed Operation Husky, with airborne and amphibious attacks on the island's southern coast. This attack was very successful, and the Allies rapidly took Sicily. It also led to great disruption within Italian leadership itself. Just a few days later, Prime Minister Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested. And then the Allies moved on to Italy. But Italy was much more expansive. The terrain was much harsher than Sicily. And actually, the Germans had evacuated from Sicily before the Allied attack, leaving something of a void, and instead had reinforced the many mountainous crags and narrow passes through the Italian mountains, which made that fighting far more difficult than what the Allies experienced in Sicily. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was instructed to make the Allied advance as difficult as possible. And so German forces occupied places like the narrow pass at Cassino, which bogged down the Allied advance for about 4 months. Other American and British attempts to move forward were hampered by rolling hills, flooded rivers, and washed-out roads. As Churchill complained, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." The Germans also took advantage of the rich history of Italy, occupying ancient cathedrals and monasteries and other buildings, knowing that the Allies would be reluctant to bomb such places outright, and instead went through the painstaking process of removing German forces one by one with on-the-ground campaigns. It was an incredibly slow and difficult advance. Eventually, the Allied forces reached and conquered Rome on June 4th, 1944, just 2 days before the D-Day landings in Normandy. At that point, the primary focus of the war shifted north to the campaign into Europe and France that way. And so, on one count, the attacks through Italy had succeeded in one of their goals, which was to distract the Germans from the other impending attack. At the same time, the war in the Atlantic was beginning to turn in favor of the Allies. The German wolf packs were being driven back and pushed back. This was due to a number of developments. Among the most important was the continuing advance of technology, which favored American and Allied efforts to combat the German submarines. The most important of these was radar, which had existed for years before but was becoming much more sophisticated, and which allowed the Allies to better detect the submarines, and also sonar, which allowed the Allies to detect the subs even when they were patrolling submerged beneath the surface. Other weapons were being developed as well that could attack the submarines while they were underwater, depth charges, and so on. But another key factor was the code-breaking effort that was ongoing during this time. There's a great movie about this called The Imitation Game, about the code breakers at Bletchley Park. And I would also note that thousands of American women were hired into code-breaking roles because it was thought that women were better at puzzles and so on than men at that time. In any case, the code-breaking efforts by mid-1943 were successful, and the Allies knew of German movements on the seas and on land. The trick, of course, was what to do with that knowledge, and there's a poignant scene in the movie The Imitation Game when they've broken the codes and they know that German subs are about to attack a British ship, and yet they can make no attempt to call off the attack or to evade it because that would alert the other side that the codes were broken. Nonetheless, information about the locations of the subs and what German intentions were did allow the Allies in some cases to make subtle changes and shifts that probably saved dozens of ships and thousands of lives.